This is an overview of the principles and practices related to managing archives. So it's not a how-to book, it's a why-to book. And as I describe it in the introduction, I say it's not a cookbook, it's a book about how to cook. So it explains the concepts of archives, the reasons historically why certain ways of managing archives have evolved, particularly in a Western tradition, and then looks at how that is actually applied in a practical setting for things like appraisal, arrangement, description, and providing access. The first audience is the archivist, and I imagine my career's been very diverse, and I work with many archivists, and I put in my head the community archivist in the one-person shop, what we call the lone arranger. And I imagine that person and say, what do they need to know to put in context the work they do on a day-to-day basis. But I also imagine the students I've taught over the years, and I think, what do they need to know to go into the profession? But I think the book has a much wider audience than that. Would love if historians read the book, because then they would understand why, when they go into an archival institution, they find archives organized the way they do. And they would understand that archives don't just appear in full flower, perfectly formed, without some application by a person behind the scenes who makes decisions about appraisal and arrangement and what to keep and what not to keep. So I would love for historians and genealogists to read it. I think the general public would find it interesting, but then I love the subject of archives, so I think everyone would find that interesting. When I wrote the first edition, the digital world was just starting to intrude on archives and records management. And I included a chapter in the first edition on managing the digital record, and it was seen as a special issue, a special topic that deserved its own chapter. By the time I decided we had to have a second edition, and I came reluctantly to it because I wanted the first to live as long as possible, I realized that we couldn't talk about digital exclusively anymore. I had to incorporate it through the whole book, questions of how to manage the digital record. So now the new book, it's a completely new book. There's half a chapter on preservation still has a lot of content that was originally there. The rest is very new, and it addresses all aspects with the digital in mind, as well as the physical, as well as the analog, the paper, the audiovisual, the tapes. But the digital was the main change that I had to incorporate. There are other changes too, because we have much more robust access and privacy requirements. We have a lot of issues around security. We live in an age now of questionable accountability. People talk about alternate facts, and the archivist is prime person to deal with this. So in the rewriting of the book, I was bearing in mind that we are no longer dealing with archives as nice cultural objects as we did 20 or 30 years ago. Often, not always, but increasingly we deal with archives as tools for accountability, to hold governments and other power brokers accountable for their work.